Tobacco consumption has been characterized over the years by considerable human and financial cost. According to Cancer Research UK, smoking claimed no less than 43,000 lives in 2009 in the UK alone, whilst also causing 60,000 cases of cancer. Seemingly never out of fashion, smoking is thought to have been the cause of up to a third of deaths in middle-aged men in the 1990s. Some reports have suggested that up to 26% of male and 9% of female deaths during that period could be attributed to tobacco consumption. The cost of smoking to the state is similarly eye-watering, with a recent report estimating that £5.2 billion of the NHS's budget was spent on smoking-related causes in 2006. £1 billion more than the cost of obesity to the NHS in a similar time period. In the present day, a recent push by governments and charities worldwide has undeniably led to an increase in the awareness of the dangers of tobacco. But despite this, smoking-related deaths are consistently and perplexingly high. What is it that keeps consumers coming back for more and more despite knowing the risks? The answer to that question is, of course, tobacco's most addictive component, nicotine. Of course, we as a species haven't always fully appreciated the risk associated with smoking and consuming tobacco. In fact, in the past, tobacco has even been used as a spiritual tool and wonder drug. But let's go to the origin of the problem. Where did tobacco come from? Tobacco smoking was first encountered by Europeans when scouts sent by Christopher Columbus to Cuba in the early 16th century found that native men were fond of smoking herbs from pipes that they called tobaccos. The natives believed that tobacco had religious, medical, and ceremonial uses. Tobacco is known to have been part of Native American culture for many centuries, and there are even stone carvings dating back as far as 600 AD showing the consumption of the substance. The missionaries quickly brought tobacco back to Europe, realizing that it had vast market potential. After the plant was introduced to the French court as a wonder drug by the French diplomat Jean Nicot, it was given the name Nicotiana tabacum, literally Nicot's tobacco. Tobacco smoking was instantly embraced by the European elite as a fashionable product of the New World, capable of curing and preventing dozens of health problems. They couldn't get enough of the plant and ravenously consumed it in all its forms. By the early 19th century, the first commercial packaged pre-rolled cigarettes were made available. By 1881, companies had cigarette-making machines capable of mass rolling up to 120,000 cigarettes per day. By the beginning of the 20th century, many billions of cigarettes were being sold per year, making it available to all regardless of social standing, and truly accelerating the world's love affair with tobacco. As you can see, tobacco smoking has been present in human society for a very long time. But why have humans had a preference for tobacco in particular? What is it about this plant, the Nicotiana tabacum, that has kept us hooked for millennia? Why are our brain and mind so susceptible to its influence?
The brain and our nervous system are made up of a complex network of wires and circuitry, much like the inside of a computer or television. The brain's wiring is known as neurons or nerve cells, and through these it is able to communicate with all parts of the body. Our eyes, our feet, our lungs, they all receive instructions from the brain through these neurons and are able to send information back to the brain through neurons as well. Throughout the body there is a vast network of neurons which allows the brain to exert control over the body it is in. Neurons are arranged into pathways which carry signals and messages back and forth. Illustrated is the simplified pathway that an electrical signal could take as neurons carry instructions to kick a football from the brain to the foot. The cells are not drawn to scale. This diagram is purely for illustrative purposes. The current that flows through a neuron is called an action potential. When one neuron meets another neuron at a junction, it is able to pass on its electrical activity or action potential to the other neuron. As you can see, neurons don't touch each other directly when they pass electrical messages to each other.
Instead, like in a game of netball where the neurons are the players and the electrical signal is the ball, the neurons pass their electrical activity to each other by throwing it across the empty space dividing them. This concept is vitally important to understanding how addiction works, as this is the process that most addictive drugs affect.
In order for a neuron to transmit its signal to another neuron, it releases a conducting substance into the gap between itself and its counterpart. These substances are known as neurotransmitters and are crucial in the process of electrical signal neurotransmission. By passing neurotransmitter to another neuron, the electrical signal is passed on to the next neuron in the sequence. Once the neurotransmitter molecules bind to the surface of the next neuron, a reaction occurs that allows the second neuron to fire off an action potential and further propagate the electrical signal it received from the previous neuron.
The brain is subdivided into various areas, each of which controls a different aspect of our behavior and livelihood. For example, in order to enable us to speak, the Broca's area is activated. When we analyze visual information coming in through our eyes, our visual cortex is activated. The different parts of the brain are made up of neurons, and they can also communicate with each other using longer connecting tracts or bundles of neurons. Nowadays, we are able to use modern technology such as fMRI to try to pinpoint the parts of the brain that are active during certain tasks. The blood supply to our brain carries oxygen, which is vital for our cells to function. The brain is able to regulate blood flow to different parts of the brain and distribute it according to our brain's activity. In other words, parts of the brain which are more active during a certain task receive more blood. So, for example, during speech, the Broca's area receives more blood flow because it needs the additional oxygen to be active. By using fMRI, we are able to visualize the blood flow to different parts of the brain by using a large and powerful electromagnet. The magnetic properties around brain regions change in response to the blood flow they are receiving, and the electromagnet is able to pick up on these changes and convert them into a visual map of activity that researchers and doctors can study on a screen. By placing a person into an MRI scanner and asking them to carry out certain tasks, we are able to see what parts of the brain are recruited in order to execute the task. fMRI and other research techniques have shown that the mesocortical and mesolimbic systems are involved in processing reward, motivation, and addiction. Together, they are known as the mesocortico-limbic dopamine system. Mesocortico-limbic system literally means the system located at the middle of the cortex and limbic system, named as such for its central location in the brain cortex. A neurological system such as the mesocortico-limbic system is a collection of brain structures which interact closely to fulfill certain functions. The mesocortical and mesolimbic systems form part of the reward system of the brain, which induces feelings of pleasure when actions beneficial for survival and propagation are carried out. For example, when eating or during sex, the reward system is activated, which causes positive sensations to be felt, making people seek out such experiences again. It's a highly effective system which helps motivate us to survive. Most importantly in addiction, the mesocortico-limbic dopamine system contains two crucial structures: the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. When these two structures are active and interacting, feelings of pleasure or withdrawal are experienced. As mentioned earlier, electrical messages and communication within different brain systems are operated through the medium of various specific neurotransmitters passing electrical signals between neurons. So, within the mesocortico-limbic dopamine system, the predominant neurotransmitter passed around between neurons to mediate the feeling of pleasure is dopamine, often called the pleasure transmitter. Nicotine acts primarily on the mesocortico-limbic dopamine reward system. Although neurons within this system communicate using dopamine when processing pleasurable stimuli, they also receive input from neurons outside the reward system which use the transmitter acetylcholine. In a way, acetylcholine acts as a switch for structures within the mesocortico-limbic system. When they receive input in the form of acetylcholine neurotransmitter, they activate and circulate dopamine around the system to initiate pleasant feelings of reward. Let's zoom in again. In order for a transmitter to bind to the surface of a neuron and initiate an action potential, it needs to attach itself to a protein on the neuron called a receptor. These are highly specific. An acetylcholine receptor will only bind to acetylcholine. A dopamine receptor will only bind dopamine.
This is due to their shape and the shape of the neurotransmitter that they bind to. Only the matching neurotransmitter will fit into the matching shaped receptor, much like in a shape-sorting toy. So here, for example, each different hole is a different type of receptor, and only the matching neurotransmitter will fit into that due to its shape. So for example, if the square here is acetylcholine, it will fit into the acetylcholine receptor, but it won't fit into the triangular-shaped dopamine receptor.
Neurons have a delicate balance of chemicals within them that let them maintain a resting, inactive electrical state. When enough receptors on their surface bind to a ligand, such as acetylcholine or nicotine, a reaction occurs that disrupts this delicate balance and initiates an electrical reaction. A certain amount of net electrical change needs to be reached for the neuron to activate. Once the required number of receptors on a neuron surface have bound to their receptive neurotransmitters, then the neuron can continue propagating the electrical message. Acetylcholine receptors, which need to be filled in order to initiate a reward or pleasure sensation, come in two forms: nicotinic and muscarinic, also known as NACHRs and MACHRs. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors have a unique property. Their shape allows them to bind not only acetylcholine, but also preferentially nicotine. Nicotine itself can be either charged or uncharged, which alters its properties when interacting with cells in our body. We are most interested in charged nicotine. This is the one that binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Charged nicotine cannot enter cells directly. It is said to be membrane impermeable. In other words, it cannot penetrate cell membranes, but it can interact with cells by binding to their NACHRs. The binding properties of a receptor are often determined by the protein subunits that they are composed of. Nicotinic receptors come in various forms, but their most common and relevant one is made up of 5 beta-2 and alpha-4 protein subunits. Because of the NACHR's structure, they have a unique shape that allows them to bind nicotine as well as acetylcholine. Contrary to popular belief, nicotine itself doesn't really have any negative health impacts. It simply acts as an acetylcholine agonist. It agonizes or activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. The serious negative health effects of smoking are brought about by other compounds in tobacco. For example, tar, which isn't itself addictive but can cause cancer.
So if we go back to our shape sorter analogy, we know that the acetylcholine molecule will fit into the acetylcholine receptor because of its shape and properties. Now the binding properties of the acetylcholine receptor are determined by the beta-2 and alpha-4 subunits that make it up. Now these are of course all wooden toys, so they're clearly part of the same set. Now what happens when the body is flooded with nicotine during smoking if we just get this? This is made of Lego. It's clearly a different set, it's from outside the body, but its matching shape means that it will still fit into the acetylcholine receptor. In this case, nicotine is known as an acetylcholine agonist. It itself is not a neurotransmitter, but its shape just so happens to let it bind to the acetylcholine receptor, just like the molecule of acetylcholine would.
Because of this, when nicotine is consumed, the mesocorticolimbic system is flooded with activation. Under natural conditions, the acetylcholine activation is tightly regulated in order not to overstimulate the reward system. However, the onslaught of nicotine, which isn't broken down by the body as easily as acetylcholine, now occupies most of the receptors. These receptors are now said to be bound to their ligands, in other words, molecules which can fit them.
This happens during smoking, and the mesocortical limbic system is highly activated as a result, giving an immense feeling of reward which can now only be achieved through smoking. As I've mentioned before, the most basic role of the reward system is to provide incentive to carry out behavior beneficial to survival and propagation. For example, it is activated whilst eating, and provides us with a positive and rewarding experience that makes us want to eat again in the future. Of course, if we don't eat, we starve and have cravings for food. We become irritable, tired, and demotivated if we don't eat. In a way, we experience withdrawal symptoms if we don't provide our body with the food it craves in order to survive. You could say that by acting on the same mechanism, addiction tricks the brain into thinking the body needs a particular substance to survive. But how exactly does flooding the reward system with nicotinic activation lead to the severe addiction often experienced by smokers? The jury is still out on what the definitive answer to this question is, because there are some contradictions within the evidence and the area as a whole is fairly controversial. However, there are some key concepts most researchers agree on. Firstly, nicotine addiction is a problem that affects neurons at the level of neurotransmission. Secondly, homeostasis plays a crucial role in the neuronal adaptations that bring about nicotine addiction. And thirdly, nicotine addiction is motivated by positive and negative reinforcement. Okay, let's deal with these problems in that order. NACHRs are distributed all over the brain and central nervous system. So although there are dopaminergic neurons within the mesocortical and mesolimbic reward system that receive input from NACHRs, there are neuronal circuits in other parts of the brain which use transmitters such as GABA and glutamate that also have NACHRs, and therefore may play a role in addiction. However, research has consistently shown over the years just how important the dopaminergic reward system is in pleasure and addiction, so, for now, we'll focus on this system. For example, studies using electrodes implanted into single rat brain cells have found that under the influence of nicotine, dopaminergic neurons fire off more action potential. Our body tries to maintain constant internal conditions and can adapt its various internal properties to responses in the external environment. This is known as homeostasis. A good example of this is the regulation of our internal body temperature. If we enter a hot room, the heat energy is transferred into our body, raising our temperature. However, our body compensates by this by opening its pores, dilating blood vessels, and sweating. And as a result of this, we keep our body temperature at an unaffected 36.6 degrees, so that our cells and internal body processes continue working at optimum efficiency. The nervous system operates in a similar way. It can alter its various properties to suit its external environment. NACHRs exist in various states of sensitization. When they are constantly exposed to a ligand, such as acetylcholine, they become desensitized. When smoking, nicotine molecules float around the NACHRs in high concentration. Not only that, but the body isn't as good at breaking them down and removing them from the NACHRs as it is with acetylcholine. Therefore, due to the prolonged and repeated exposure to nicotine, NACHRs become less sensitive to them. When nicotine is constantly available, it is no longer a novel stimulus and the receptor changes to a desensitized state. The dopamine levels and reward system activity drop back to their normal levels despite the continued presence of nicotine. In other words, nicotine consumption is required in order to maintain a normal level of happiness. Thanks to homeostasis and the body assuming that the continued presence of nicotine is the new norm, a state of nicotine tolerance has now been reached. Not only that, but nicotine consumption has to be elevated to achieve the same pleasurable kick as what the original dose used to give, as the original dose now only maintains the normal levels of happiness that was standard before smoking. Reinforcement of smoking behavior is a crucial part of understanding nicotine addiction. Positive reinforcement is something that occurs which makes a particular action enjoyable or rewarding.
Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is off-putting. A particular behavior or action brings about unpleasant consequences and feelings. The act of smoking and consuming nicotine is positively reinforcing. The nicotine-induced increase in brain dopamine levels is pleasant. This alone encourages repetitive smoking. However, tolerance to smoking means that abstinence is particularly unpleasant. This is due to withdrawal symptoms. Stopping consumption of nicotine once tolerance has developed means that activity of the mesocorticolimbic dopamine system drops below its normal levels, which requires nicotine to be maintained. The consequent decrease in dopamine levels in parts of the system, such as the nucleus accumbens, trigger withdrawal symptoms. Much like abstaining from food or drink, abstinence from nicotine causes a variety of unpleasant psychological, behavioral, and physiological sensations. Anxiety, weight gain, tiredness, irritability all negatively reinforce the act of abstinence and make the addiction to nicotine so hard to break. So where does this leave us? Well, to summarize, nicotine addiction is a multifaceted condition which affects the body and mind in a variety of ways. There is still much to find out about the complex interactions of nicotine and the brain structures it acts upon, and the inconsistent evidence in the scientific literature highlights how much is still unknown. However, bringing together the considerable expertise that we have acquired so far about various neurotransmitters, cell systems, and brain areas affected by nicotine has no doubt helped build a fairly solid model of how addiction works, and this has greatly helped our understanding of nicotine and helped researchers and healthcare professionals develop more powerful therapeutic tools.